thank you, Joe, for inviting my colleagues and myself to represent the Northern Ireland contingent of Ireland. I've been blown away by what you're doing in the Republic of Ireland in comparison with what we're doing in the north of Ireland. So I think there's a bit of jealousy on both sides. But anyway, I'm just going to talk about basically the condition of our protected site network in Northern Ireland, because quite frankly, that's really all I know about. So I'm Bobbie Hamill. I work for Northern Ireland Environment Agency, which is part of the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland. And you look at this slide here and you sort of think, oh, well, where's the woodland there? But that's it, scraped along the side of what is the famous Glenariff Glen, and this is Glenariff Woods. And we've talked about the woodlands in Northern Ireland and how small and insignificant they do appear. This was one of the first SSIs ever declared in the mid-80s, and it's 66 hectares. Doesn't look like much from the outside. But if we just have a little peek inside, we can see that it's just an absolute array of beautiful spring flowers and is obviously, I'm not sure whether it's ancient or long established, but I would call it semi-natural habitat in fine condition. And it has the species and it has that structural diversity with the waterfalls and things like that. So I'm just going to cover our protected woodlands in Northern Ireland, and we've been assessing the condition of those woodlands over the last 22 years. Basically, what have we found and what we did, and what we have learnt about the condition and how we need to adapt to changes in knowledge and pressure. And they're not as bad as 1% favourable condition. You know, they're bad, but they're not that bad. And then there's future threats and basically the unknown. So areas of special scientific interest, SSIs, that's the name of our national designation for our woodlands across Northern Ireland. And they're there to protect the very, very biggest and the best sites that we have in Northern Ireland for future generations, And we want an adequate representation of all of the woodland community types that we have in Northern Ireland right across the country to be selected in that protected site network and to protect the species and the features there. Obviously, the designation of SSIs was long before the development of any ancient or long-established woodland inventories. So what we did was we did a map search of all of the semi-natural woodlands across Northern Ireland, mapped them from aerial survey, etc., did a rapid reconnaissance of them, and a full survey of all of the woodlands above a certain size. This is just an example of what we looked for. This is the Sperrin Woodlands in Northern Ireland, in the Sperrin Mountains, and we wanted to select our SSIs based on the biggest and the best, those that had the most diversity, those that were the most natural and supported the most rare species, against the minimum amount of exotics and disturbance. So it brought up a scoring system, which we have here from top to bottom, and starting at the top, we've been working down, designating those sites as SSIs. And consequently, some of them have been selected as SACs. But as I said, I want a representation of all of the woodland features across Northern Ireland. So we've mentioned the oak wood, the mixed ash woods, the wet woodland, and not to forget the wonderful wood pasture and parkland, which we saw at Crom today. I just want you to look at this particular picture. This is Fairhead, and again, just look at the woodland. It's clinging to the cliff face. This is where our woodland remnants occur in Northern Ireland. Just very quickly to go through the different woodland types. We've got the oak wood. We've talked about the acid soils, dominated by oak and birch, holly, rowan, understory, and greater wood rush larch. Again, this is Hanging Rock in County Fermanagh, clinging to the cliff face. The canopies dominated by ash, understory, hazel, goat willow, and it's typically that wonderful ground flora that we looked at in the Glenariff woodland. So, but you can see there that the canopy's looking very healthy and nice in that particular picture. And then we've got the wet woodlands, which are wet, waterlogged soils, and they're very, very variable depending on the water whether it's acid or base rich water, and it's your typical alder and willows, etc. And as we saw today, the wood pasture in Parkland, well, it obviously occurs in a range of soil conditions, and it's no specific community type, but it's really important for those ancient trees, and we can't forget about it as a very important habitat in its own right, with its open grown canopies and the fungi, lichen and invertebrates that those species support. And like Paul earlier, I had to put a picture of the beaver oak in. This is what we think is the oldest tree in Northern Ireland. Interestingly, the picture on the left was taken about 15 years ago when it was completely surrounded by a larch plantation, and the tree was really struggling to survive. And then with photographer coming in, the trees were felled, and it's opened up a good wee bit. So you can see the picture on the right, it's looking a wee bit healthier. I'm not 100% sure how healthy it is, but it's still alive, which is wonderful to see, and long may that continue. So this is just to give an outline really of basically where all of the number of ASSIs and SACs that we have. So we have 80 ASSIs across the range of habitats: oak woods, mixed ash woods, wet woodland and wood pasture and parkland. And then we also, interestingly, we include the Tiliacerean forests of the slopes. We have 2 sites designated as SAC for that in Northern Ireland, and that's not recognised as a habitat in the Republic of Ireland. And this is where they all are. As you can see, the oak woodlands in the yellow are largely to the northwest of the country, and that sort of coincided with where they occur in the northwest of the Republic of Ireland as well. And those pink ones up the right hand side there in the northeast, those are the really famous hazel woodlands of the Antrim Hills, which don't tend to have any ash in them because it's just the soil is just too thin to support them. So that's the designated site network. But what we've been doing is monitoring these. We're collecting the evidence. I'm not doing policy or anything like that, or look, I'm supporting the evidence, or providing the evidence for our policymakers to take this forward. So we've been undertaking condition assessment for 22 years now. Why do we do it? Well, we've talked about that a little bit in some of the previous presentations. For reporting purposes, we measure targets. You know, we don't want too much sycamore, we don't want bare ground, etc., etc. We identify the threats and the pressures and assess the effectiveness of management that we make to try and reduce those negative impacts. And in Northern Ireland, because we're part of the UK, we use the UK Common Standards Monitoring. It's a repeatable, rapid reconnaissance of the woodlands, and it's based upon setting clear objectives and standards. So we measure a number of attributes, such as age structure, canopy cover, understory, ground flora. On the positive side, on the negative side, we record things like goat damage and overgrazing, etc., etc. And then ultimately we state whether it is favourable or unfavourable. If it is an unfavourable condition, that is not catastrophic. It means that it has some small thing going on in the woodland that could be made better by a little bit of management. So the just as the attributes, as I said, extent, structure, regeneration. Regeneration is hugely important. We've talked about that quite a lot today, and those negative indicators as well. And therefore, if you set a target and you don't achieve that target, well then ultimately your habitat or your feature, woodland feature, is in non-favourable condition. This is how we did it. This is Ryland Gold, which is in the Crom estate, and it's just a case of putting a number of sample plots out across the ground like this, visiting them on a regular basis on that 6-yearly cycle, going back, recording exactly the same thing in exactly the same place for each monitoring cycle. And this is the sort of data that is collected at each of those sampling points. So sort of the structural variation, canopy cover, shrub cover, field cover, etc. age class variation. The condition of the ASSI features, Paul Armstrong mentioned that earlier. He said 1% of Northern Ireland's ASSIs are in favourable condition. It's probably a bit more than that, but it's not great, as this clearly shows from the second cycle of the Article 17 reporting that the majority of our woodlands are in favourable condition, but that does not mean that they are not still very, very special places with a huge number of, with great biodiversity. But the reasons for failure, again, we've mentioned it over and over again: grazing and browsing, lack of regeneration therefore, and the structure and vegetation composition, invasive species. So how do we fix it? Well, some things are very straightforward. Fencing woodlands to keep stock out is absolutely so important, and we've done that largely across our SSIs. Goats and deer, much more difficult to address, and again we've discussed that, but we're working on it, but it's a long way to go with that. So how do we fix invasive species? Again, we control them, but in Northern Ireland we're not really doing this in a very systematic way because of our land ownership and patterning. It's very difficult to get little landowners to take on the management within agri-environment schemes, etc. But we're doing a bit, but it's achievable again. And structure will fix itself, maybe not in my lifetime, but providing we have the management right, trees will mature, we will get epiphytes, etc. And it just takes time, providing we get that regeneration taking place. So that's all right, we're going okay as far as we thought. We've protected our protected sites. There's still more to do. We're starting to fix some of the features or attributes which we found were unfavourable, and then we have the emerging pressures and threats that we've seen over the last 10 years. So I have been surveying woodlands for well over 30 years now, and when I first started out, the only place where there were deer that I ever saw was at Crom. There was no deer in any other woodlands in Northern Ireland. I used to visit Scotland and they used to talk about the deer problem, and I thought, we don't have that. The ash dieback wasn't even thought of, and eutrophication wasn't mentioned either, and neither was climate change. But over the last 10 years especially, these much more difficult emerging pressures and threats have been identified. I thought that looked like a very cute wee deer there, and we all think that he's very nice, he's a wee sika, but we know that the deer can be hugely to woodlands, killing trees as well as completely eradicating all of the structure within the woodland. And it's just an exponential growth of deer right across the north of Ireland. Ash dieback, again, there's not an awful lot that I can do about it, certainly, apart from record it, look for resilience in trees, and consider possible replacement species, and that's something I think we need to discuss on an all-Ireland basis. And here we have Hanging Rock, that picture that I showed you earlier of a beautiful, healthy ash canopy, and here it is, just taken last year, and you can see how severely impacted it has been by ash dieback. Northern Ireland has hugely high levels of ammonia and nitrogen deposition. Now, I work a lot in the bogs, so I would be recording a lot of the damage that I'm recording on the lichens and the sphagnum mosses there. But it also, as we've said, damages the trees, and particularly those most sensitive, like the lichens and the bryophytes. And in Wales, in fact, I think they even complain that our nitrogen is impacting their bryophytes in some of their most special woodlands. So it's a very significant problem with the ammonia nitrogen deposition far exceeding what we would expect. And this is the Xanthora, which we mentioned earlier. We don't want to be seeing this on our woodlands. Climate change is the biggie as far as I can see. I took this picture earlier in the year in Caledon Estate, which is another parkland site on the border of Armagh, and it was total devastation. It's not an older tree coming to the end of its life and falling. that happens. Our parklands are at that point. But it was just huge winds coming through, ripping out the trees and knocking huge numbers of them down. And I've also seen trees that are clearly dying of drought, or on the other hand, trees that are drowning and dying of being submerged in water for too long periods of time. So climate is starting to really impact, and I don't think we have any idea where that's going. So we're only just starting to think about how do we monitor that. So what have we learned over the last 22 years? I think we need to be a bit more flexible. I think some of our targets are unrealistic. We can't expect that we're going to have 5% or less than 5% sycamore in our native woodlands moving forward. We have to be a bit more lenient than that. So we can't be too prescriptive. And we need to be flexible and adapt to the changes in those the knowledge and pressures. And we just really need to think forward in a much more ambitious way. So resilience is everything. This is the fabulous Coral Glen in County Fermanagh, and we've talked about woodland expansion and planting trees and buffers around SSIs, allowing them. In this case, you can see that the trees are starting to creep up into the valleys and things like that. Bigger is better. The bigger the woodland, the more resilient it is, the more buffer it has. So I take my hat off to everybody who's spoken today about planting trees and expanding woodlands. I suppose there's part of me that sort of says, you're planting trees, you're not planting woodlands. And I think it'll probably take a couple of centuries before those develop into woodlands. My job is to protect the very good, the best of the best, semi-natural, long-established woodlands as they stand today. But I want to see them expanded. I want to see them being protected in every way possible to make them more resilient to climate change moving forward. And thank you very much. But I think this is a classic picture, because Malachy mentioned earlier on, we should have maybe started planting these parkland trees a few years ago. I would suggest, probably 150 years ago, we should have been doing a lot more tree planting. But you can't. I sometimes I think we're doing too little, too late. But you have to be positive. We have to be positive. We are where we are. We can only go forward. All of the woodland expansion that everybody has spoken about today is absolutely great. I think we're miles behind the Republic of Ireland, I would have to say, with our policies and strategies and the development of woodland. And taking a more strategic approach to woodland expansion in Northern Ireland. But we are where we are, and I'm the evidence giver. That's all I am. So thank you very much.